Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with Dr. Kyle Keltz. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you are a professor of English and also philosophy. I like those two things. And we're going to be talking today about a question that people ask regarding death before the fall. And they say, could a good God allow death before the fall? Before we start unpacking, let's first talk about what do we mean by death before the fall?
Okay, yeah, and that's great because there are a few things that you could confuse when talking about this with people who aren't familiar with it. When we say death before the fall, I think probably the most important word is the what do we mean by the fall? And what we're talking about is basically Genesis 1 through 3. When we talk about the fall, we're talking about Adam and Eve sinning in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 1 and 2 talk about God creating human beings, and He puts them in a garden. There's some interesting things. His special presence is there with them. But it talks about them being innocent and basically enjoying God's presence and being in the garden. When you get to Genesis 3, it talks about how Adam and Eve sinned and disobeyed God. And when that happens, not only are they kind of stained with sin, but they're also kicked out of the garden and they're separated from God. And that's what we mean when we say the fall. Now, when we talk about death before the fall, that might sound like maybe we're talking about human death, but we're actually asking about whether animals died before the fall. Because it's there's things in Genesis that indicate that Adam and Eve were probably either naturally or supernaturally immortal before they sinned. But what we're asking is, did animals die before that?
And so when we talk about death before the fall and animal death before Adam and Eve sinned, from a young earth perspective, where the earth and all of creation is about 6,000 to 10,000 years old, that might not be an issue. But from an old earth perspective, we do have to do the work of answering that question of how could there be long but finite periods of time and no death. So what does that look like? So what is the issue with regard to animals dying before Adam and Eve sinned?
Yes, and you got right at it because what happens is people when you read Genesis 1, it talks about God creating certain things. He creates the land and the sky, and then He fills it with creatures. And after He creates, it says that He pronounced this is good. He sees that it is good. Well, people think that because He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, whenever He creates something and it says that it is good, then there's not going to be any deficiencies in it. Now, from an old earth perspective, when we look at the natural history of the earth, what we find is that it looks like animals have been dying, they've had diseases, and they've been suffering for millions of years before humans ever showed up. So there's this issue with, well, how do we reconcile that? When God created animals and He said, this is good, was He talking about animals that were susceptible to disease and dying?
Right, and then if there was no animal death before the fall, but then there is afterwards, then was there this giant shift in how predators, how they functioned and what they ate even? So how do we go about answering such a question of whether a good God would allow death before the fall? And how do we answer that?
Well, there's several ways you can approach it, philosophical, biblical, and theological ways. One thing I like to emphasize that I think it's not much, but it's a little helpful from more of a philosophical standpoint, is to just kind of step back and realize that from a Christian standpoint, what we believe is that only God is infinitely perfect, right? Now, when you think about what the kind of world He's going to make, and it's going to be it's going to be a physical world. When you think about it, since only God is infinitely perfect, any world He's going to make is going to actually fall infinitely short of His perfection. So even if He made a world that initially didn't have animal death in it, this still isn't infinitely perfect. But anyways, I just like to throw that out there. But when we start talking about more theological concerns, some people think, I think especially like young earth creationists and other Christians, they think that when you look at Romans 5, the Apostle Paul says that death entered creation because of Adam and Eve's sin. Now, if you look at that passage closely, though, you'll see that the Apostle Paul is more like saying that death spread to all humans, to all people. So I don't think that you can use that to conclude that animal death was a result of the fall. And to me, it seems more likely that animals probably were dying before that. And I think the key to that is to notice in Genesis 1 where it says that God created human beings in his image. Now, a part of being an image bearer is that you are supposed to represent God.
Right.
You know, that's why it's so bad for us to sin. And that's why Jesus tells us to be perfect like our Heavenly Father is perfect. That's a part of what we're supposed to be is being made in the image of God. Human beings are supposed to represent God. Now, a thing about that, though, is that one of God's attributes is wisdom, okay? So if God is going to create his image bearers, and a part of that needs to be wisdom, kind of an obstacle is that you can't infuse wisdom into people. You know, wisdom is something that's earned, it's not created. So what I think is whenever God tells human beings to be fruitful and multiply, what he was wanting them to do was to spread out over the earth in his image, you know, always obeying him, but also learning from him and becoming wise in the process. An interesting thing is that when you study some of the ancient church fathers, there's a church father, 2nd century church father, Irenaeus. He writes about something similar to this. He says that the Garden of Eden, this is in his work, Proof of Apostolic Preaching, and he also talks about the Garden of Eden in Against Heresies. But he talks about how the Garden of Eden was a local paradise, better than this world, and God put human beings in it so they could rule over the earth and so they could learn justice from God. And then when they sin, he kicks them out of the garden into this world. So it's really interesting. It seems like Genesis 1 through 3 is telling us that Adam and Eve were supposed to learn wisdom from God. Now, another thing is biblical theologians think that when you read Leviticus, it teaches that the closer you get to God, the closer you're getting to order and life and holiness. The further away you get from God, the closer you get to chaos and death. Now, I think it's highly likely that when God told them that if they touched or ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that they would surely die, they understood what he was saying because they would look out outside the garden and they could see that if they're going to eat from the tree, they're going to get kicked out, and they're going to be in that world of disorder. So, long story short, is that we think if they would have obeyed God, possibly by now, if Adam and Eve and none of their descendants sinned, now the earth would look like Revelation 21, where God's presence would be everywhere.
Right.
So, you know, whenever God creates animals and says this is good, he doesn't mean that they're perfect and they don't die. He means that they're doing exactly what he meant for them to do. And when you look at science, you see that the world is set up so that we've got ecosystems. Animal death and predation is just a natural part of that, and it's all for our good so that we can be healthy and be alive and be humans.
Well, and I think you make a good point, because sometimes people think that by God saying very good, that this current world is perfect, but obviously God was not surprised by what unfolded, and so this was very good for the plan that was already in action. Thank you so much for that. If you'd like to hear more about this topic, go to reasons.org and search Death Before the Fall.